by the Internet Freedom Foundation. Why we do it on August 24th is we celebrate a point in time when the Supreme Court reaffirmed the fundamental right to privacy. And quite often, privacy is a very broad right which links to all our fundamental rights, as the Supreme Court stated. But today, it really links very, very intrinsically to informational privacy, which revolves around how our society is becoming more and more digitized, and personal data as well as surveillance are conversations which are occurring on a much more regular basis. For instance, while a lot of people say people don't care about privacy, when WhatsApp changed its privacy policy, I noticed there were people not only from our community, which is very active on digital rights, but also in our families and friends group who inquired about what was the implication of that privacy policy change. Now, given that this judgment was given 4 years back, there was also a marked necessity of all institutions of the Indian state to take it forward, which includes the parliament. And for this, we have a panel which we have invited Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He's kindly consented. We have him here. And this interview will be conducted by Mitali Mukherjee. This is going to be a conversation which is going to be reflective. It is going to be also beyond what we are usually accustomed to, those short bites, towards a much more generous amount of time, which is stretching to almost an hour, in which you can also learn what has been the approach of political parties, the institution of parliament, as well as Dr. Tharoor's own views about privacy itself. After half an hour break, what we also aim to do is take in a much more global view. And this year has been a little disappointing for privacy, but we know this fight will always be incremental towards creation of better norms, processes, regulations. And one instance which has come across very clearly, which is concerning to all of us, has been Pegasus, which is a spyware which has been deployed on several smartphones in India and also potentially for people all over the world. And given its global context, people who have been researching Pegasus and spyware from the very beginning, based out of the Monk School, out of the University of Toronto, which is called Citizen Lab. We have the director from that, Dr. Ronald Debert from there. And to conduct today's sessions, I'm also joined by my colleague Anushka Jain here, who will be introducing the second panel as well as giving the vote of thanks. So I won't build a greater amount of distance between you and the conversation. You're waiting to hear. And I'll turn it over to Mitali Mukherjee for this conversation with Dr. Tharoor, which I myself am looking forward to eagerly.
Apar, thank you so much for that. I hope we can do justice to all that you've outlined over the next hour. Before I begin, I'd also like to give a shout out to the Internet Freedom Foundation gang. You guys have been working relentlessly in the space of data privacy. And we really need voices like yours to amplify this and to make this an issue for everyone, not just a small group of people. May I also introduce, of course, our guest for the next hour, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who does not need any introduction, but let me give it a crack anyway, Member of Parliament, and most importantly, Chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, which is why his voice will lend a lot of weight to this conversation. For those joining in, I just want to take a second to set some context to our conversation, which will largely circle around Pegasus, which, as Apar, very diplomatically put it, has put a bit of a setback to the whole conversation about privacy this year. In July this year itself, a group of about 17 media organizations came together on what they called the Pegasus Project. Essentially, these organizations did a deep dive and a huge amount of research to reveal that the spyware Pegasus, based out of Israel, or a company in Israel, was actually being planted systematically across the world. In India itself, there were more than 300 names that came up that included politicians, activists, lawyers, and many ordinary citizens as well, quite surprisingly. The other important point I'd like to put across about Pegasus is that this is treated as military-grade spyware. We're not talking about the tapping of phones. We're talking about a far more serious offense. At this point, the government of India has stated that they have not voluntarily purchased any such software. However, I would like to juxtapose that with the fact that the Israeli firm themselves have said that they sell the Pegasus spyware only to quote unquote vetted governments. Investigations are already underway in countries like France, but what about the road for India? More importantly, let's divide this conversation into a couple of parts. What does it mean for privacy? What does it mean for democracy and electoral process? And most importantly, to my mind, what are the remedies in place at this point? Dr. Tharoor, you're going to be in the hot seat now for the next hour or so. Let me start with a little bit of context, sir, where, these revelations are from July, but some of this goes back to 2019, where vulnerabilities were found in WhatsApp itself, and the Pegasus spyware was detected. That did go to your standing committee at that point, sir. What happened of it? And, can you bring us up to speed for everyone who's joined in on where investigations are progressing?
All right, let me start off by saying one thing, Mitali, which I need to for the record. Though I am chairman of the IT committee, I'm not speaking in that capacity. It's very important to stress that because there have been some ructions, as you probably know, within and around the committee. And I want to make it very clear, I'm not pretending to speak for other members, nor indeed in principle do we discuss internal discussions of the committee until such time as a report has been submitted to Parliament. So I'm speaking as somebody who's interested in the issue, who's aware of it, who's conscious of it, and who has individual views, and I speak to my individual views. So that's something I should lay out right on top. Now, on 2019, that immediately ties my hands that I can't reveal what goes on. But I think what's openly known that I can confirm is that when the Toronto Citizens Lab wrote to a number of people in India stating that they had been compromised through their WhatsApp accounts by a spyware called Pegasus, a number of them wrote to me as chairman of the committee. And I decided to invite them to testify before the committee at fairly short notice. But they came. We had representatives. We had about 3 or 4 representatives from different victims, as it were, of the 20-odd people who had received letters saying they'd been compromised. I think, again, it's fairly well known that the ruling party's members of the committee, who actually constitute a majority, tried to prevent a discussion. Witnesses were kept waiting for a couple of hours, 2.5 hours, while they argued the subject was not appropriate for the committee to discuss, which was a mind-boggling position to take, given that it was on our agenda under the heading Citizens, Data, Privacy, and Security. Can't be more explicit than that. But matters came to a head. There were detailed discussions. A vote finally had to be called, and the vote was finally settled. 12-12 in favor and against the discussion, with me as the chairman casting a second and casting vote to permit discussion. We then had these witnesses come in and testify to us. And then we called in the government witnesses and asked them to clarify, because, it's important to understand that interception, as interception is legal, placing malware is not, and I explain both of those in a minute. And there is, under the interception consideration, it is legal to invoke a sort of national security reason for the government to either not address an issue or to explain why they've done something. I must say that in 2 separate sessions, spread over a few weeks, we were unable to get any clarity on whether anybody in the government, central government at least, knew whether Pegasus had been ordered, paid for, or deployed. And no one sought a national security exemption. In fact, no one sought anything at all, frankly, other than to say that they had no idea. And we're talking about the Secretary of IT, the Home Secretary, though he, in fact, could not wait for the committee to thrash out whether it was going to discuss matters, so he sent the additional secretary, but nonetheless, a person with knowledge of this. And the bottom line at the end of it all was we had no clarity on the issue. Now, why was this not reported promptly to Parliament? Because it's the topic that we had to conclude discussions on. And citizens' data, privacy, and security involved a number of other issues that were still being discussed. And until all the discussions were over, a report cannot be drafted, then thrashed out and agreed upon, and then submitted to Parliament. And then what happened with these other topics, well, very frankly, the committee never quite finished discussing them. When the Pegasus scandal erupted again in the middle of this year, that is in July of this year, I again as chairman, summoned them to attend. And again, two things happened, both quite extraordinary and both widely reported, so I'm not revealing anything indiscreet. The first is that the 19 people turned up for the meeting, of whom 10 were members of the BJP, who sat in their chairs, spoke, but refused to sign the attendance register, thereby depriving the meeting of a quorum. The quorum in our committee is 10 people. That is 1/3 of the total membership. We have 31 members, 2 seats are vacant, so 29, divided by 3, the next highest number, 10. And we don't have 10. We had 9 who wanted a discussion and had come for it. But for good measure, the 3 government witnesses, the 3 secretaries to government who were to testify, all found excuses 15 minutes before the event to send urgent messages saying they couldn't come, which I promptly reported to the Speaker of the Lok Sabha as little short of contempt of the House. Now, that's the full background, the overall story as to why we've had this. But I'm happy to clarify, since I mentioned very briefly, if you're interested, Mitali, on why it is possible to intercept but not possible to implant spyware under the law, and what the law provides. Should we go into that?
I would like to delve into that in just a second, but let me ask your personal capacity then, Dr. Tharoor, whether the revelations of July by The Wire here in India lend much more credence to the issue. Because, there was a feeling from 2019 that there was a little bit of back and forth, there was discussion and debate, and then the issue was almost brushed under the carpet. There is a feeling of frustration amongst those who are watching this carefully, that perhaps everyone is complicit and the inaction is almost deliberate, which is why I'm asking you, in your personal capacity, given the revelations of July, do you believe that there is now a far more concrete case to be looked at in terms of spyware, and what's that is doing to the privacy rights of individual citizens?
So, yes, I personally had no doubt on either occasion that the issue warranted serious investigation and discussion. On the first one, the targets were one specific category of individuals, namely human rights activists of various descriptions and of various ages and seniority, specifically caught up in matters related to what the government would normally characterize as left-wing extremism, the Bhima Koregaon case, and so on. And therefore, the balance of probability was indeed that they were targeted by the authorities, either center or state, and there was a specific motive for so targeting them. But the new revelations of this year pointed in a far broader and more searching direction. Why? Because obviously the list of targets identified by the investigation conducted by The Wire here, and I think 16 outlets around the world, 16 media outlets around the world, specifically pointed to a range of people of political as opposed to any other kind of interest. That is, you find names like Prashant Kishore, the election campaign manager of the Chief Minister of West Bengal, during the very time that the election campaign in Bengal is being fought. And he submits his phone for analysis to the Amnesty lab, and it's confirmed that he was hacked as recently as the day that he submitted the phone. Rahul Gandhi, who is the leading figure of the principal opposition party. Other individuals of political connection, Mamata Banerjee's nephew, some aides, and so on. People associated with the ruling party, including 2 ministers. Now that seemed more peculiar, though you can always imagine there are multiple motives for checking, and you don't have to have such suspicions as such. You may simply want to vet somebody the way in which the American FBI vets a cabinet appointee before he's appointed, perhaps something like that. What's going on, who knows? And then you've got 40 journalists. Now, why 40 journalists? It turned out they're all people who are interviewing various opposition figures in our political space. And so the assumption was it's the kind of stories they were reporting, and more important, the people they were speaking to who were of interest. Now, this, of course, is rather alarming, because our democracy can't function on the basis that the ruling party can use taxpayers' money to deploy such devices for its narrow political information gathering, and therefore its narrow partisan advantage. If that's going on, then we have already, forget about a level playing field, we already terribly skewed the arena within which the various other political interests in our country are competing for attention, for space, for power. And therefore, that's fundamentally worrying. Secondly, if they can tap such a large array of people because they have the resources that others don't have, then of course no Indian citizen is truly safe. You may not be of interest last month, but you may be of interest next month, and therefore everyone who's listening to this has every reason to be concerned. Now, again, I should stress, we cannot officially determine that this has been done by our government. There has been no basis to determine that, but there are a couple of considerations worth flagging. Number one, Pegasus says they only sell to governments and government agencies. That too, those vetted by and approved by the Israeli government. They need an okay from the Ministry of Defense because Pegasus is classified as military-grade spyware, as military-grade weapon, in fact. The second consideration is if only governments could buy it, then of course there is an entirely fair argument to be made, which I've suggested, that if our government denies it, some other government might be using it to snoop on our people. But that's where the target list comes in. This is not the head of RAW, the chief general, the defense minister, any individuals in positions that are normally considered to be of interest to foreign governments. These are people whose role and whose interest appear to lie entirely in the political arena. And it seems rather unlikely, or shall we say less likely, that a foreign government would adopt this particular target list if it were deploying Pegasus in India. Now, for these two reasons, there is some legitimate concern and suspicion that perhaps the government has deployed this against Indian citizens. In any case, there is enough grounds for a thorough and serious investigation.
Mm. Let's circle back to the point that you made about legality, sir, because at this point, the only communication we have, both from Mr. Prasad and now from Mr. Vaishnav, is that, under the sections of the ID Act and the Telegraph Act, they've gone on to say there are provisions for lawful interception of electronic communication for the purpose of national security. Now, I'm playing devil's advocate for a bit and asking you whether something like Pegasus actually is permitted. I mean, does the Act permit the installation of spyware? Is that what the terminology is? What are we looking at from a legal perspective?
Okay, so what happened is that the Information Technology Minister, Ashwini Vaishnav, who of course was one of the two ministers targeted by Pegasus, he declared briefly in Parliament before he was drowned out by disruptions that any form of illegal surveillance isn't possible in India, given the checks and balances in our laws and procedures. He said that under our robust institutions, there's a well-established procedure through which lawful interception of electronic communications is carried out for the purposes of national security. So that immediately looks you to look at where lawful interception is made possible. Now, the Indian government has the power to surveil, monitor, and decrypt communications. Section 5, open brackets 2 of the Indian Telegraph Act, 1885, and Section 69 of the Information Technology Act, 2000, broadly known as the IT Act. So the Telegraph Act and the IT Act both allow for the interception of telephone communications and electronic data, and there are very specific grounds where the interception is permitted. In the interest of the sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, or for public order, or for preventing incitement to the commission of an offense, which is why the 2019 WhatsApp cases seemed to some to perhaps offer grounds to the government to plead that they were acting illegally, though they didn't claim it at that time. Now, there are two interesting complications here. The first is the exercise of this power was restricted because the Supreme Court issued guidelines in a case called PUCL versus the Union of India back in 1996, saying there are no procedural safeguards in the Telegraph Act, and we must have a clear set of procedures. Interception can be ordered legally, but it must be ordered by the Home Secretary or the Home Secretaries of state governments. These must be sent to a review committee within 1 week with the details and the number of persons intercepted, and that the period of interception can only be for 2 months, though that can be renewed by a special decision, not beyond 6 months. And the role of the review committee was then codified under rules of the Indian Telegraph Rules, Rule 419A, if you want to be aware of that. But the problem is, of course, the decision is made by a bureaucrat, the Home Secretary, and the review committee itself consists of other bureaucrats, the Cabinet Secretary, the Law Secretary, and the IT Secretary. A second big catch, Mitali, is all this is about interception of communications. But what about hacking? Because what we're talking about amounts to hacking. Now, hacking is against the law, because if you read the Information Technology Act, which is what deals with this sort of thing, Section 43, read with Section 66, says that unauthorized access to a computer device, computer resource, or computer network can attract imprisonment up to 3 years or a fine which may extend to 5 lakh rupees or both. Now, what exactly is this? Well, in 2000, when the IT Act was passed, you had mobile phones, you didn't have smartphones. So in mobile phones, the assumption at the time the act was drawn was that essentially it would be people listening into you, which can be legally justified, as I've just explained, for national security grounds. But taking control of devices or hacking them through spyware or malware is actually explicitly disallowed unless you get a very complicated ruling saying that a mobile telephone in your hand, a smartphone, is not a computer device. To my mind, and to almost any technical definition, of course it's a computer device. And if it's a computer device, then putting something into it is actually an offense under the IT Act. And it's also a gross violation of the right to privacy, which the Supreme Court has meanwhile recognized in the Puttaswamy case. So surveillance using a spyware tool like Pegasus will be basically de facto, ipso facto, illegal. That's the essential problem. And this is why I call for an investigation. I'm not a judge, Mitali, and certainly a committee made up of MPs, whether it's the IT committee or, as some people call for, a separate joint committee. The only difference between because all our committees are joint of both houses, so the only difference between the established standing committees and a joint committee would simply be that the joint, a new select joint committee just on this issue would have to be chaired by the ruling party, whereas the IT committee is chaired by me. So already on the data privacy bill, they thought of this wheeze of taking it out of my committee and putting it on the committee under BJP chair. They could do the same here if they wanted to resort to a committee. But my answer is that all of us, however well-intentioned or sincere or professional we are not judges. And there are limits on the powers of committees. We don't have the kinds of powers that an American or a British parliamentary committee, an American congressional committee, or a British parliamentary committee would have. Whereas a judge, for example, could call for evidence, could actually ask you to submit your phone and have it subjected to forensic analysis, which no parliamentary committee can do. Can also subpoena witnesses, which no parliamentary committee can do. We can summon people on certain limitations, but we have no enforcement powers in our committees. And finally, a judge would be somebody who could actually weigh the evidence and come to a conclusion based on it. So for all of these reasons, I called from the very outset, the day the scandal arose on the 16th or 17th of July, I said, this needs a Supreme Court monitored investigation. I've stuck to my guns ever since. I do want to stress that as far as I'm concerned, this is a serious matter which potentially affects the privacy of every Indian citizen. And that's why it's incumbent upon our government, like every other government mentioned in these things, to take it seriously enough to authorize an investigation. It can be by the Supreme Court, it can be by under the Commission of Inquiries Act. But whatever it is, we need something.
And of course, for those who are perhaps not up to speed, this has gone to the court. A second affidavit has been asked for from the government. So that one remains in process. Dr. Tharoor, even assuming for a moment you go with this national security debate, I think what was deeply disturbing was the nature of the individuals targeted. And I'm asking you this as not a politician, but a citizen. What happens when a Supreme Court staffer who has leveled sexual harassment allegations against the then Chief Justice is on that list? Not just her, there's 11 members of her family who are also on that list. What national security risk does an individual like this pose? And more importantly, what is the recourse for an individual such as this? Where is she supposed to go when there is this massive spyware underplay for a sexual harassment allegation, which in any case must have taken her a lot to have stood up and called it out?
No, I agree with you. It really is dismaying, to put it politely, that such a thing could happen. I don't want to, again, jump to conclusions, but again, the fact that this lady, and I believe 11 people connected to this matter, were all surveilled is truly, I could even use the word shameful. And it's a pity, because we're looking at something which, in any case, was settled in the interests of the Chief Justice, the then Chief Justice himself, in a process he monitored. And so it is extremely unnecessary to violate the privacy of a victim, or at least, shall we say, an alleged victim, in this manner. It's most unfortunate. And the thing is, again, the thought that keeps coming back is, if they can do it in that case, if they can do it in this kind of case, if they can do it to people like that, they can do it to anybody. And that's why no one is truly exempt from the implications of what happened with Pegasus.
The standard response, often from political parties as well, Dr. Tharoor, is that data privacy is seen as an elite issue. It's not something that touches the larger public. But, going back to some of the examples that you raised, when you target somebody like Prashant Kishore in the middle of and through the West Bengal elections, when you target journalists that are reporting on important issues, I mean, is this not corrupt electoral practice? Is this not completely reneging on someone's democratic rights?
So that's the very serious political aspect of this, which is that we all know how important how important the Bengal elections were to the BJP. We fully understand that this was almost make or break for them. The Prime Minister, the Home Minister, all sorts of people repeatedly came. They even took great risks to the health of the nation by their large number of mass rallies and public events at a time when the dreaded second wave was beginning. And they did all of this in order to win. And clearly, there was a perception that they needed to pull out all the stops, have every bit of advantage they could possibly wrest in this scenario. And one of the advantages they could have is information about what the other side was thinking, what the campaign strategies were, what the person organizing the campaign wanted to do, intended to do, or was telling the chief minister and other party leaders he was doing. And for this reason, it's clear Pegasus was deployed. Now, as it turned out, we all know the election results didn't go the way the BJP wanted. But had it gone the way the BJP wanted, and this had come out, would it not have vitiated the integrity of the result? Are we going to create a situation in our democracy where the party that happens to be in power can misuse vast sums of public money, taxpayers' money, in order to score political points over their immediate rivals, whether in state elections or in national? These are very serious charges. These are ethically extremely dubious kinds of conduct. And I think, we really ought to call for this to be exposed and dealt with.
It's also a slippery slope at this point for India, Dr. Tharoor. I mean, we're talking about Pegasus, but even as, it's sort of going towards an investigation but hitting a brick wall. There's so much else that's at play in the Indian landscape. I mean, there was a very casual mention of facial recognition technology being kicked in. There's CMS, NAT-grade, Netra. In fact, some of these, I think, are in violation of the Puttaswamy judgment itself, something that, we are marking as a milestone today. And this is happening in the context where many other nations, including the EU and the US, is actually moving away from this. I guess as an individual citizen, the question you're asking is this an inevitable outcome? And what can I do to push back on this?
Is it an inevitable outcome? Well, it's in our hands as a democracy and as a society to try and hold to account those who have tried to do this. What can we do? There's where you get into slightly more challenging territory. First of all, the judiciary offers in many ways the best hope, because the judiciary may not be very quick in its actions, and therefore may not help address the issues that are immediately the subject of our urgent headlines, but it can take the long considered view that is so often absent from the political process. Secondly, and that's one aspect of the whole thing. Secondly, there is the very legitimate need to balance what we are seeing happening when it comes to the increasing development and creation of a surveillance state in our country, versus the understandable requirements in the 21st century for the government to have enough technological mastery over data flows and information, especially involving sensitive foreign countries, terrorists, and major criminals, all of which would require the government to have certain capacities which we would only object to if they were used against lawful and law-abiding citizens. How do you strike the balance? Now, it seems clear that if our government did what it seems they have done, that the balance was completely lost. But otherwise, I would say a responsible government of India, a country that's in a tough neighborhood and is besieged by various security threats, some of the national security capacities and some of the technological abilities to intercept communications and even eavesdrop on communications from those specific targets, the targets being criminals, terrorists, and hostile foreign governments, that capacity the Indian government must have. But there's got to be sufficient restraint and public condemnation of deploying that capacity for political purposes or any other petty purposes against the citizens of this country, against people who are simply going about their lawful business. Now, this becomes a genuine challenge because by definition, if the capacity is secret, we don't know how it's being deployed. Here we actually have a boon in that this revelation, global revelation, has confirmed that something like this is being deployed in ways in which it was not authorized to and is not permitted by law to be deployed in India. And the question, therefore, is, can we use this opportunity? And I include journalists like you, NGOs like the Internet Freedom Foundation, public-spirited citizens going to the Supreme Court and so on, everyone who cares about these issues, can we use this to prise open the veil of secrecy under which the government wants to conduct its cloak and dagger business, and see whether indeed we can have sufficient teeth to the law so that they can have this capacity but not use it against their own people. That's the question. I don't have a simple answer, but that's the desirable principle.
By the way, for our audience, we're at the half-point mark, more or less, with this conversation. So in case there's questions you would like to ask of Dr. Tharoor, please start posting them. I
will have to have a hard stop at a minute to 5 because I have a malfunction in my constituency.
Copy that. I want to go back to the point you were making, Dr. Tharoor, about journalists raising their voice and organizations like IFF raising their voice. There is a feeling that privacy is an alien concept for for people within our country. Do you think that needs a bit of a reset as well? We need to push back harder. We need to say that, what, this is counted as one of our fundamental rights, and you cannot go about collecting data without any clear cause or outcome.
Yes, in fact, the principle that you've just stated is absolutely, unarguable. I think we should all follow that principle. In addition, there's a draft data protection bill that's still being battered around a joint parliamentary committee that is tasked with coming up with comments on the bill. When they have done their report, it then has to go to the ministry concerned, then to cabinet, then come back to parliament to be voted. So we are some months away from a conclusion of a process that will lock all this in a cast iron way to give Indian citizens very clear rights over their own data. In the context of data privacy, I have taken the stand, going back to before I had anything to do with the IT committee, just as an ordinary MP. I've introduced a private member's bill, which of course, like most private members' bills, didn't actually get discussed, but a bill in which I proposed two basic principles that we should enshrine in our law: that data belongs to he or she who generates it, namely to the citizen, not to the state. That the state may access it for specified purposes and for limited durations of time consistent with that purpose. And thereafter, the data must be destroyed or returned to the person who generated it. And that any disputes will have to be adjudicated by an independent data protection authority, which should consist of a cross-section of interests from the judiciary, technology experts, as well as ordinary citizens, consumer user groups. Now, those principles have not been upheld in the government's draft. And in fact, they have got something they call a data protection authority, but as with the review committee in the IT Act, it essentially is, or the Telegraph Act, it essentially is a bunch of bureaucrats ruling on the decisions of other bureaucrats. Now, I know from my conversations with retired cabinet secretaries that when they are given by the Home Secretary a 15-page list of numbers that the Home Secretary has deemed appropriate to tap or to intercept, that is the Cabinet Secretary, does not in practice have the time to go into a detailed analysis of these numbers and so on in the review process. So Cabinet Secretary told me very frankly, the review process is a farce. Now, can you imagine if you have that kind of approach built into the government's thing, then any interception the government conducts will automatically be approved by the Data Protection Authority, because it'll literally be a busy bureaucrat overseeing the decisions of another busy bureaucrat. And there will be very little serious time and review being given to this. So I'm hoping that the opposition MPs on the Joint Select Committee on the Data Protection Bill will have raised these points. I also wrote officially to the chairman making all these points. But at the end of the day, Mitali, we haven't seen what's coming out of that committee. And the short answer is, I don't know what the law will or will not permit. I think we all have a sense of what is desirable for the law to allow and not allow, but what will actually happen, to see.
There is one question from the audience, sir, and I think it sinks in with something that I was going to ask you, because I hear more and more from what you're saying that this has to go to court. This has to find some kind of remedy or solution within the judiciary. Are you saying then that the parliament is at this point unable to resolve this? And the question that's come in is, without help from the media, can the opposition do anything to make the government accountable? Is there any out-of-the-box solution?
Well, look, I believe in continuing to try and do my duty, which is to convene another meeting as soon as possible. The Speaker had requested that he be given time to meet with the committee members and see whether he could cooperate, get them all to cooperate. He did not, in the end, find it possible to hold such a meeting. We have now a previously scheduled committee tour, which is an annual exercise of every parliamentary committee. So during that time, we will be roaming around the country for the next 10 days. But subsequent to that, I think it's likely we will need to try and meet again. But do not forget the last time that a meeting was attempted, the majority party well, two last times. On one occasion, they tried to prevent discussion. On the second occasion, they tried to deny the meeting a quorum, and that they clearly have instructed the three secretaries to government concerned in tandem to find reasons not to come, all of which does not actually offer much hope that the parliamentary committee will be able to discuss this with much ease. And the honest truth is that in any other democracy, the ruling party would be shamed by the public and by the media if they tried to behave in this way and thwart a discussion. Our country, the issue warranted a very minor mention in the papers and very little awareness of how earth-shaking it was for one party to essentially, in government of course, to essentially tell the bureaucracy not to cooperate with the Parliament Committee. In any other parliamentary democracy, this would be a resigning offense on the part of serious senior officials. It's utterly shocking that we have such low levels of expectations, it seems, from our system. Now, there's one more technical issue. The mandate of the Parliament Committee is actually renewed every year, and the committee's mandate comes up for renewal on the 12th of September. You're aware that one particularly obstreperous member has repeatedly and publicly, through letters released in the press, called for my removal as chairman. So it is not at all guaranteed that after the 12th of September that I will be in a position to deliver the approved agenda of the committee on these issues and allow it to proceed and do its work. To my mind, we're looking at potentially a sort of crisis when it comes to adopting or readopting the agenda for the following year. And one will really have to see how all this goes. I don't want to presume on anything. I have been doing my job with integrity and with honesty. I've been very clear when I speak in a personal capacity, and I've been disapproving of the orchestrated leaks from the committee by people who are hostile to the committee's work. But I have tried at the same time to take the committee along. I have 5 years experience as chairman of the External Affairs Committee, where we dealt with very sensitive issues without the slightest disagreement or dissent, or not a single dissent note ever being recorded, as we unanimously adopted reports that have, I believe, stood the test of time. The IT committee has turned out to be somewhat more problematic, and we'll have to see how that goes.
There is another development of the last 4 years, Dr. Tharoor, which is the slow but quite apparent crumble of the federal structure, whether it is in terms of economic cooperation or what happened at the peak of COVID between states and the center. And one suggestion that's being put forth is that perhaps states, just like West Bengal and the chief minister there have done, should go ahead and start independent inquiries of their own. Do you think that's another way to galvanize force and opinion in this regard? Should states start, conducting investigations on their own into Pegasus and
well,
what they know?
My understanding is that the constitutionality of that matter is already up before the courts. That is, that can a state government, which undoubtedly seems to have been a victim of this process, conduct a judicial inquiry which would necessarily involve central government agencies and which would also seem to be in an area of nationwide communications that are the domain of the central government on the central list. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm certainly not a judge, and I'm not going to presume on the outcome, but it's very easy to construct an argument that if every state government felt free to set up such inquiries, that you would essentially have legal chaos on some issues. Now, I hope that that's not the conclusion, because I think all of us feel that as long as the center is unwilling to conduct an inquiry, we feel that at least someone is doing it. But it also may be difficult for the state government, for example, to compel cooperation from a central government official who is instructed by his own prime minister or home minister or minister to not cooperate. I mean, how do you resolve the standoff? It's a very complicated issue, Mitali, that I don't think anyone has simple, straightforward answers to.
Am I wrong, Dr. Tharoor, in reading a tone of resignation in your voice about this issue in terms of, what the parliament or the political process can do, whether or not we can even have a conversation about, a personal privacy charter. Are you feeling resigned by the process? Are you feeling hemmed in by the process, or do you think
No,
that?
not resigned. I'm not a giver-upper. I'm not a quitter, but I am incredibly frustrated. Perhaps what you're hearing is the frustration coming in through my voice. I was looking at some of the questions in the chat room, and one of them talks about how the united opposition could do something in the Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Pegasus issue. I should stress that the committees all reflect the actual balance of the House, of houses. So in this case, we have an overwhelming BJP majority in every parliamentary committee. So once the ruling party is absolutely determined there should be no discussion, even on the most flagrant potential violations on any issue, it becomes entirely feasible for a majority to prevent discussion, as we have seen as recently as the Pegasus problem.
I am mindful of the fact that you have a time limit going. So let me wind down by asking you a question where, sum up to, in your mind, what is it that a victim should be doing and an ordinary citizen should be doing, Dr. Tharoor? Because for the victim, it says, go to court, file a case in the police, push this, but it seems like recourse is quite limited. What do you do as a victim? What do you do as an individual citizen at this point to really safeguard privacy as a concept?
As a victim, I think it should go to the Supreme Court. That's my personal view, and I've advised those of the people whom I know to have been targeted to do precisely that, because, as I mentioned fairly early in our conversation, Mithali, I do believe the judiciary offers the best recourse to actually getting to the bottom of what happened, much more than any other institution in our system. The investigating agencies are under the central government, and Parliament has the limitations we already talked about. So the judiciary is the answer. What can the individual citizen do? There you really end up with some resignation, and the answer probably is nothing, because at least with the WhatsApp leak, the WhatsApp vulnerability that was probed by Pegasus sending a missed call, apparently the technique was to send a missed video call on WhatsApp. You would answer it, the person would hang up, and then Pegasus was in your phone. So there, at least in theory, you can tell people, never answer a missed video call from somebody you don't know, or just, take away WhatsApp, use some other device to communicate because WhatsApp is vulnerable, whatever. Now, the problem is that Pegasus has become so sophisticated now that they don't need any of those techniques. Yeah. Apparently, they're able to put themselves on your phone now without recourse to a missed call, without the user having to click anything.
And even data,
so you can't even warn a user, for God's sake, don't click on an unknown link, the usual stuff we get on the internet, because in fact, with Pegasus, even that doesn't save you. So I try basically to take recourse in the feeling that essentially I should proceed on the operating assumption that anything I'm saying or writing on my telephone is potentially in the hands of people who don't particularly care about me. But since my conscience is clear that I'm not doing anything anti-national, I'm not conspiring with terrorists, and I'm not contemplating the commission of any crime, I basically told myself, let them see it. I can't spend all my time worrying about it. Now, I know that sounds like a slight bit of resignation. There is nothing I can do. But you tell me, Mithali, what is that?
You should have the answers, sir. You're sitting in Parliament. I can only ask you the questions. But
all right. Well, then the answer is I don't think that it's reasonable for us to ask any individual citizen of India to take any particular precautions. I mean, I think we've seen Mamata Banerjee putting a tape on her phone camera. I'm not sure that's going to prevent these folks from getting into her phone if they want to. So my advice is we essentially say that we have to use a judicial route to bar certain kinds of snooping by the government, to make it impossible and illegal and with severe consequences for them to do anything. Because, it's both illegal, as I mentioned, and it's unethical because it's a misuse of taxpayers' money for the narrow partisan political interests of the ruling party. That too is something that the public ought to disapprove of. I must say, I am surprised at how much the issue has died down in 1 month, and how now outside specialized circles like this forum organized by the Internet Freedom Foundation, how little discussion there is anymore of Pegasus. The government may well have calculated that if they drag this on long enough, people won't care. And mood of the nation polls and all of this kind of stuff that's going on have not even made a big issue about whether people do believe the government should be held to account for what happened on Pegasus. So, our democracy is as robust as we, the people of India, make it. If we are essentially complicit in the undermining of our own democracy, then who do we turn to for succor? It's ourselves, it's our own country, it's our own system. If we're essentially saying the government can do all this and get away with it, there we are. Not much we can do.
And of course, when we turn to the judiciary, we also turn with the hope, Dr. Tharoor, that they are above this, which, as recent events have shown, perhaps may not be the case. This was a sobering conversation indeed. We really appreciate your time and your thoughts and your patience with taking on all those questions. And we wish you luck for the standing committee. We're hoping that there is some light for this issue over there. Thank you very much again for joining.
Thank you very much, Mitali, Apar, and the Internet Freedom Foundation. All the best.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
First conversation, yes, and I am going to hand back into your very capable hands, Anushka and Apar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitali. We are really grateful for your time as well as for the interview you conducted today. Thank you so much. And now I'll turn this over to my colleague, Anushka Jain, who will briefly introduce the next panel, which will follow in the at 5:30. We've kept this half an hour buffer because we also realize that quite often people do not have the sense of time to sit at the same place for about 2 hours, and they would like a break. The next session, in fact, will be very interesting. It will have Ron Diepert, who's from Citizen Lab, as I told in the introduction itself. And Citizen Lab has also just released a new report. So I'll just hand it over to Anushka, who will be taking forward these proceedings on behalf of IFF. Welcome, Anushka.
Thanks, Apar. First of all, before I introduce the next panel, I want to thank Ms. Mukherjee and Dr. Tharoor for that enlightening conversation. As IFF's Associate Counsel for Surveillance and Transparency, I'm grateful that you could spare your time from your hectic schedule for us and our community who have been benefited the most from hearing your views on this pressing issue. We share your frustrations with regard to the lack of investigation of the Pegasus revelations, and this discussion today will surely motivate all of us to continue to voice our demand that the government looks into and investigates these revelations. Transparency and accountability with regard to the shocking violation of our constitutional rights is necessary, and we thank you for highlighting the need for all citizens to take this matter seriously. Privacy Supreme will continue after a short break at 5:30. Newsworthy's Anubha Bhosle will be in conversation with Professor Ron Diepert, who is the director of Citizen Lab. As some of you may know, Citizen Lab was the organization that conducted the peer review of Amnesty Tech Security Lab's report on the 2021 Pegasus revelations. Citizen Lab was also the one that in 2019 first revealed India's involvement in the Pegasus scandal. So see you at 5:30 for that conversation.
Folks, we are live.
Thank you, Shivani. Welcome back, everyone, to Privacy Supreme. IFF is delighted to host this annual event marking the anniversary of the right to privacy decision of the Supreme Court, as it allows us to remember that the fight for our democratic freedoms is a continuous one which cannot be taken lightly. For our next panel, we are excited to be joined by Anubha Bhosle, who is the founder of Newsworthy and the former executive director of CNN-IBN. Ms. Bhosle is an award-winning journalist and entrepreneur who has reported on issues related to politics, social justice, conflict, and citizen movements. She's also been an ICFG Knight Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, and a Jefferson Fellow. Ms. Bhosle will be in conversation with Professor Ron Diepert, who is the Professor of Political Science and the Director of Citizen Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. The Citizen Lab is an interdisciplinary laboratory focusing on research, development, and high-level strategic policy and legal engagement at the intersection of information and communication technologies, human rights, and global security. It was the Citizen Lab which first revealed the ongoing use of Pegasus against Indian citizens through a report in 2019. Since then, they have continued to work against the rapid proliferation of such spyware. Citizen Lab also conducted a peer review of the report of Amnesty Tech Security Lab concerning the recent revelations related to Pegasus and NSO made by The Wire and other news organizations in July 2021. Thank you and welcome Anubha and welcome Professor Deeper. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anushka, and a big welcome to all your viewers joining in. Ron, it's an absolute privilege to be speaking to you, and that very illustrious introduction means that I have so much to pack in this next 60 minutes that we have with you. I think the IFF has also made it clear that we're inviting audience questions, so we'll try and squeeze in a little bit of time for that.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you, Anubha. It's great to be here with you.
Ron, so why don't we start with the very basics, so to speak. How did Citizen Lab come to actually peer review this particular Amnesty and Forbidden Stories project Pegasus? My question is more towards what was known to you at the point in time when this list came to you, the origins of the list, and was that a factor at all?
Thank you for the question. Well, the Citizen Lab, which is based at the University of Toronto, has a mission to investigate targeted espionage. And we have for over a decade now been investigating cases in that area and have focused in particular on the commercial spyware market. There are mercenary companies out there that supply government clients with tools to hack devices and monitor civil society. There's extensive abuses around this industry that we've documented. Amnesty International has something called the Tech Lab that started recently. They're partners and friends of ours. They do very similar work. We've collaborated together. In fact, we did a report together on a hacking campaign in India, not related to NSO's Pegasus, that we could talk about perhaps. So we are in close conversation with our partners there quite regularly. And Amnesty International informed us that they were working on an extensive report around NSO and Pegasus. Because of sensitivities and various confidentiality requirements, they couldn't tell us much about it. They did request that we do a peer review, both of their methodology that they were using, their forensic methodology, and also a more direct peer review of a subset of some of the phones that they determined were hacked with Pegasus. We were not given access to the list of phone numbers that you describe, and still don't have access to them because of confidentiality reasons. I can say that the peer review, as you can read in our website, was very straightforward. Their methodology is sound. That's not surprising. We use very similar techniques to what our colleagues at Amnesty International use. And the forensic analysis of the devices that were shared with us also verified what Amnesty discovered. And I'd like to add that we were given copies of the backups of these devices, essentially mirror images of the disks, without any context whatsoever. We were just provided with these and said, tell us what you found. And within literally, I think it was a minute in each case, our lead researcher, senior researcher Bill Marzak, was able to quickly confirm that they were all hacked with Pegasus. The list of numbers has been described only in general terms by Amnesty International and Forbidden Stories because they want to protect the source. There's some concern that whoever provided them with this list of phone numbers might be at risk, and so they're describing it only in very general terms. I believe that, based on what I've seen, that the list is a kind of pre-reconnaissance database. So in other words, government clients of NSO will use this service that provided this list to identify the phone numbers to see if the phones are active before they then fire off Pegasus spyware. So that's essentially my understanding of how the list evolved. Are you still there? I believe I may have lost Anuba. And Anushka, can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we lost Anuba. She's just joined back. I think she'll be with
Okay.
us in 2 minutes. Hi, Anuba. Can you hear us?
I can. I am
Perfect.
extremely sorry for that
No
loss
problem.
of electricity and the loss of connection. And I'm sorry to have missed the last part of your answer, Robert. Ronald, I'm wondering if this is something that you've already answered, then you can skip it off. But I think my question was, is it a factor at all that we should know about the origins of the list for which you've done a peer review and for which it has become clear that some of the phones in India and across the world did have the spyware of Pegasus? Is that a factor? Do the origins of the list matter?
They do and they don't. First of all, we didn't do a peer review of the phone numbers per se. We did a very narrow peer review. I have not had any access to this list. Based on my understanding of how the communications infrastructure globally works, and based on the correlations that have now come forward, including our report just published this morning, where we went to Forbidden Stories, asked them to check a number of phone numbers to see if they were on this list, and they can confirm that 5 were. This list has strong empirical grounding, I would say. It is good evidence of government clients of NSO doing a kind of reconnaissance of targets. So say I'm a government client and I wanted to hack your phone. I might go to this service provider, let's call it, who can inform me maybe the make and model of your phone and whether your phone is online and whether it's in a particular geographic location where I'm able to hack you. Then I might fire off Pegasus at your phone. So I think this list is very credible. I have no concerns that details on the origins of the list have been withheld. That's very prudent. You're a journalist, you know sometimes you have to protect your sources. That's what's happening here.
Great, so that's good to hear, and that's a great stamp, Ron. I'm wondering, this is not the first time the Citizen Lab has encountered Pegasus, so to speak. Your findings as far as Project Pegasus are concerned, do you believe they're consistent with what the Citizen Lab has found about the NSO and about Pegasus over the last couple of years? And is there some diversion? Are we moving towards a different direction with Pegasus, with Project Pegasus and the findings now?
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. I would say it does indeed fall squarely in line with what we have observed ourselves and published prior to the Pegasus project. What it does is simply amplify all of the findings in every possible direction. So we knew already, based on our own public reporting, in particular a report published in 2018, that NSO's technology is used by a wide range, dozens of government clients. A lot of those government clients have very poor human rights track records. Their security agencies lack oversight. So not surprisingly, this technology is going to be abused widely. We had a case that you'll be familiar with in 2019 involving WhatsApp and an NSO exploit at that time, very similar to the Pegasus projects. We had a very short window of targeting that data that was shared with us by WhatsApp. And we were able to identify more than 100 civil society victims in many countries around the world, including, I think, at least 30 in India at that time. So the Pegasus project has simply added more evidence to the already existing mountain of evidence of widespread abuse of this type of commercial surveillance technology. We're really talking about something that I've been describing now as despotism as a service, right? You are, autocrats, dictators, illiberal regimes, corrupt authorities. In the past, it would have been very difficult to do this type of surveillance. But thanks to companies like NSO Group, and thanks also to the fact that we all carry around these devices in our pockets at all times, dictators, autocrats, despots can reach across borders silently into the pockets of their targets and observe everything that they're doing. This is powerful technology that I believe it's an epidemic, and it's probably one of the most serious threats to liberal democracy and human rights today.
That's a really strong phrase. I want to talk a little bit about NSO. All these weeks and months since that story broke, the NSO has sort of continued to insist that they don't really know if and how their clients, which means governments, actually use this spyware. There are two parts to my question. For a military-grade supplier of surveillance to, as you said, countries with very poor human rights record, is that a believable argument, number one? And number two, if you have an Israeli defense ministry as sort of the vetting agency, is that really a safeguard for a global order? I mean, forget about enough of a safeguard. Is that a safeguard for a global order?
Well, the short answer to one is no, it's not credible. And the short answer to two is it's no protection whatsoever. So I can elaborate. With respect to the first question about NSO's claims, first of all, NSO is engaged in a kind of PR theater. Over the years that we've been doing reports, we've had exchanges with the company. We've heard and read their responses. They have one out this morning. Basically, what they do is cast aspersions, ad hominem attacks on groups like Citizen Lab or Amnesty International, questioning our motives, saying that we're doing this for ulterior reasons or whatever. They never actually point to a specific error in our research. And I should add that our research is open and public. We are a university-based research group. So, we pride ourselves on having everything that we do undertaken through peer review. So, those reports have been up there for years. I'm not aware of a single error in those reports that anyone has pointed out. If we at Citizen Lab can observe NSO's infrastructure and the abuses that we've documented extensively now, surely the company can do it themselves. So I do not believe virtually anything that the company says at this point, or its various shareholders, investors, PR groups that the company has hired. This is all, as I said, theater. An attempt to shroud and confuse people about what they're doing in order to continue making a profit. And the most recent report we just published this morning is further evidence of gross negligence on the part of the company. There is no way that this company can claim it has any meaningful human rights due diligence mechanisms in place when it sells to serial human rights offenders like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, or what's going on in India or Mexico, go on and on and on, these cases. So I just don't think it's credible at all. Interestingly, the second question you asked, NSO Group does go through an export control, export license review process. And that process is undertaken by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. This points to a failure in the regulations around this industry. For whatever reason, Israel is very permissive when it comes to these export licenses. I don't know, I'm not privy to what type of decision-making goes on, but all I can say is that NSO continues to sell to some of these notorious illiberal regimes worldwide. And so they don't seem to care about the human rights component of the export licensing process, which suggests there's some kind of geopolitical play going on here, which is not really surprising. Israel, of course, has an extensive geopolitical strategy of its own in which NSO Group's exports figure prominently in my mind.
I want to touch sort of on the global surveillance market, so to speak, how big this business is, what would be the cutting edge technology, so to speak, available. But considering, you touched upon NSO and their public appearances, I saw a brief clip on 60 Minutes on CBS, on which I think you were there as well. And I think you were talking about an important point about that we're allowing these clients or quote unquote governments to actually frame what is a crime, what is a terrorism, what is terrorism, and who they can go about surveilling, and the fallout of that. Speak a little bit to that you've almost got one particular ministry sitting as a veto power, so to speak, and allowing other governments to frame what is terrorism, what is a crime, etc.
Yeah, this is, you absolutely hit at one of the key weaknesses around, the pretense of safeguards that NSO and companies like them say they have in place, which is they always claim consistently, we only sell our technology to government clients who use it to investigate serious matters of national security and crime. Well, that sounds very straightforward and plausible and legitimate. The big problem that you rightly zeroed in on is that what constitutes national security worthy of investigation, what constitutes a criminal offense, is in the eye of the beholder. So time and again, we've seen journalists, lawyers, even academics, research scientists, and others framed as criminals, described as terrorists. Jamal Khashoggi, the murdered Washington Post journalist, executed for speaking his mind and writing columns in the Washington Post. From the perspective of Mohammed bin Salman, I suppose Khashoggi's a terrorist or a criminal. So what the company is doing is simply handing this extraordinarily invasive technology over to government ministries and agencies that are going to predictably abuse them. And that's the problem that we have right now, and why I think it's what I would call an epidemic.
Ron, Shashi Tharoor, who's an Indian parliamentarian and in the opposition, was in session 1 of this. And he's made this statement before as well, that, we really have no clarity from the government whether Pegasus was used, bought, deployed. And that yes, today there is a legitimate concern that the government of this country may have used spyware against its own citizens. I am wondering, and you're right, when you said that this is all about the beholder, I'm wondering, why is it so tough for us to add both elements of this equation, considering there is a company that says that they sell only to vetted clients, and considering we found, the Pegasus spyware on Indians, and considering their role is in a very domestic sphere, they're people of interest really in a domestic sphere. So you've really got all angles together. What would it take to sort of complete this equation?
Well, the equation's already been completed as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we have now ample evidence of targeted espionage against civil society in India, let's call it broadly. Our own reports show that. The WhatsApp case that I described involved us notifying several dozen members of Indian civil society, not all of whom came out publicly. This was in 2019. I think around 18 or 20 of them eventually did. So we know about them. We also know about the Pegasus project, international, outside, separate from the list. The list is evidence of some kind of reconnaissance. It doesn't necessarily mean those people were hacked. But Amnesty did go out, I think, if memory serves me correct, positively verified 11 of the devices or so were hacked. So that's a very significant number. Look, it's not surprising, really. Most countries around the world have very few safeguards around their intelligence agencies, around their security agencies, my country included. You know, we know very little about how those agencies operate because they operate in secrecy behind closed doors. Of course, governments are not going to be frank and forthcoming about that sort of stuff because they can conveniently say, either deny that it's happening or say this is a national security matter. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at the Indian case and realize that you have pretty widespread abuse of police powers and intelligence powers. India also has a very well-resourced foreign espionage capability, and it routinely engages in espionage abroad. You know, that's just the reality. Politicians will try to dance around it and make it sound like it's not happening. But as far as I'm concerned, the circle has been closed here. We know exactly what's going on.
Okay, and I think, you know, it's true for the Indian government, and it's really true for many governments who've been caught sort of in Project Pegasus in a sense. I think the two statements that we've heard from most governments, national security, and the fact that we have safeguards in place or an oversight mechanism in place. Ron, if I can sort of go to the next part of this conversation, this is targeted surveillance, right? Yeah. How do we sort of cross the road and take it to mass surveillance? Or is that already happening? Is technology already there for that purpose? And I'm wondering, this is expensive. So if there was to be mass surveillance, it needs to be cheaper, easier, less complicated, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question too. The way I look at it is within a very short period of time, really within 10 to 15 years, we've all rushed headlong into an embrace of these digital technologies. I was in India just prior to the pandemic, and I don't need to tell you, your audience, how extensive mobile technologies are in that country. It's the same all over the world. Everybody has at least one, maybe two devices. The problem is that the entire ecosystem upon which all of this rests was not built with security in mind. It's invasive by design because of surveillance capitalism, the business model, which is essentially about trying to put more and more sensors in your devices to gather as much information about you for basically economic reasons. But that creates huge insecurities that governments now exploit thanks to the assistance of the surveillance industry. So one way to think about the surveillance industry, you have targeted espionage, which we've been talking about, which is essentially hacking devices. But then you have many other layers of service providers that do different types of surveillance provision. Mass surveillance is, of course, a bedrock of this. There are many vendors that supply telecommunications companies and by extension intelligence agencies or police forces with equipment that monitors traffic at scale. It's interesting, I think, and important to note the relationship between this type of surveillance and the business model of surveillance capitalism, because they cross over seamlessly. I'll give you an example. There is a huge industry around location tracking data. Almost all of your applications ask for permission to observe your location. Then there are companies that essentially harvest that data and then monetize it. Some of that monetization is directed towards other businesses, maybe in advertising. But some of it is now directed towards law enforcement, towards intelligence agencies. That's very rich, highly invasive data. You know, your phone can tell a lot about your movements, and we're essentially emitting this digital exhaust at all times. So an enormous industry has sprouted up that essentially vacuums all of this up, analyzes it, and then presents it as a product or a service to a client, whether that's another business or a government security agency. So frankly, the system is broken, and we are now seeing the harms that result from this incredibly insecure, poorly regulated, invasive by design infrastructure that we live upon.
I love this phrase, digital exhaust, that we're all emitting at all points in time. Ron, so then to sort of take your argument further, if there is this product in the market and the business model of the surveillance industry works this way, there is nothing to stop that product from today being used for one purpose and tomorrow being used for tracking a peaceful protest, right?
There really is little, I would say. I mean, part of the aim of what groups like Amnesty International Tech Lab do, Access Now, EFF, the organization here as well, you know, all of us are trying to raise awareness about these problems, identify issues that raise human rights concerns, whether it's artificial intelligence, facial recognition, whatever. We're doing our best. So I wouldn't say there's nothing. You know, to the extent that we can raise awareness, bring public pressure, perhaps some remedies could be introduced. What we desperately need is a wholesale set of regulations around the tech space that restrain what governments and companies can do with the data that they collect. This will be uncomfortable and painful because we've gotten used to the convenience of an always-on digitally connected world. It's very fun, it's very useful, but it has a dark side, and the dark side is causing serious harm. We need to address it.
I think it would be sort of remiss of me if I didn't add the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, because in many ways, the pandemic has sort of opened the inroads, right? We have almost sort of opened our arms and said, come take everything that you need to know, you know, about us, but just keep us safe. So there's sort of this wider acceptance, if I can call it, or a fait accompli, so to speak, that yes, you know, we have to give this, these are the times we live in. How do we tackle that?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. COVID is a very serious, beyond the obvious parts of the disease itself. There is this issue around the kind of new normal that is being rolled out around surveillance. Some of it is perhaps justified, right? We're in a serious emergency. Many people have lost their lives. India in particular has had terrible trauma and grief around what has happened. I'm very sorry for that. So in such a context, of course, you want to use technology to be able to monitor and prevent and mitigate the disease from spreading. The problem is exactly what I talked about before. We're relying on an infrastructure that is invasive by design, poorly regulated, insecure, and prone to abuse. And then we're very quickly building on top of it a biomedical surveillance architecture. So it's kind of like the analogy I'm using is, imagine you have a house and the foundation for the house is rotting. And yet you're going to build a second floor addition to the house. You know, eventually the house will collapse or perhaps make you sick, right? And that's what we're doing here. We're entering into a new phase where we're relying on these very invasive technologies, and they have all sorts of pathologies connected to them. So I see this as, you know, it's often the case in history, events like this pandemic, or even an event like the Olympics. What happens is, these are moments in time where governments introduce all sorts of special measures, right? And extraordinary powers and new types of technologies are rolled out. But after the event passes, whether it's the pandemic subsiding or the Olympics finishing, that infrastructure remains in place. We've seen this all over the world, and it's happening right now with COVID. So we have to have our eyes open for those type of risks.
You know, this is a slightly sort of skeptic view of it, but, you know, many citizens will actually sort of come forward and get into this debate with us and say that, hey, these are the times we live in. There are good uses to surveillance as well. And at this point in time, it's sort of so much technology. And as you've said, this digital exhaust being fumed into privacy are you comfortable with? So if you've got sort of nothing to hide, then you should be okay about it. How do we challenge this particular notion, and why is it problematic, if at all?
It is problematic, although I understand the sentiment. I often feel the same way. It's like, oh, I need to get from one part of town to the other. I better pull out Google Maps or something, right? I'm not going to worry about it. Or I hate vacuuming my house. Maybe I'll get a Roomba and it will monitor my entire layout of my house and send that off to a company. The issue about if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. The problem with that argument is very basic. People who abuse power don't care whether you have nothing to hide. They want to take advantage of innocent people. That's why they're bad people. And there are a lot of bad people on the planet. I have seen firsthand evidence in our research of friends, innocent family members, children of targets having their phones hacked by governments because they want to get at their mother or their sister or whatever, gather incriminating photos that can be used for blackmail. So this is why we need safeguards. We need restraints. We need regulatory restraints around what governments and companies can do so that bad people don't exploit the fissures and the opportunities that are provided to them to do bad things. It's as basic as that.
Every government who would have responded to Project Pegasus has possibly used these two words, right? That we've got safeguards in place, we've got oversight in place, our surveillance, so to speak, matches the test of legality or national security, etc. In the Indian context, considering you've had 3 reports on Bhima Koregaon as well, and you put forward suggestions on oversight, what do you think is missing?
Well, I think the key ingredient that is missing here is independent oversight, right? So, Ronald Reagan had this phrase that he said to Mikhail Gorbachev, trust but verify, right? And that's the same logic we need to apply to government security agencies, right? We just can't take them at their word. So we need to look at the safeguards. Are there institutions in place that can responsibly and credibly verify that there are no abuses of power taking place? That is it's a question of political architecture, really. Like, do you have this set up in your country? I think it's fair to say that it's not there in India, because we know that there are extensive abuses. The case you mentioned is particularly noteworthy because what happened here is people were arrested, charged with crimes, and then it later emerged through forensic analysis that incriminating documents were placed on their devices directly. So this is what we're talking about here. Bad people can do bad things if there aren't safeguards in place to watch them. So we need to watch the watchers, right? That's part of what Citizen Lab does. That's part of what Amnesty International does and other groups do. But we are outside of formal mechanisms. We are watchdogs, but we don't have any power or authority. You need there to be some institution that has power, that has authority, that can come forward in the public interest and say, this government security agency is stepping outside of its bounds and it needs to be punished in some way. Right now, that's not happening.
And I think it needs to be pointed out here that the IFF itself has done some stellar work on this and sort of pointed out how many of these safeguards or oversight are sort of mere placeholders, so to speak. Ron,
absolutely.
I'm sure
I love IFF. Shout out to IFF. Well
Shout
done.
out, yeah. I was during the course of my research and sort of journalistic work, I understood how Citizen Lab got involved with Bhima Koregaon, but I think maybe for the average citizen, how did you and the institution go about working for 3 years on sort of a case that has got public imagination now, but in 2018 when the violence broke out, I remember there were just snippets of information and no one ever realized that you would link Bhima Koregaon and human rights activists to Project Pegasus one day,
Yeah. So for Citizen Lab, we our scope is global. I mean, we are not just focused on India. We're focused on countries all over the world. As you see, we have a report out this morning on Bahrain. We are also quite a small team, actually. There are only a few people that work in this area in the Citizen Lab. So we are definitely overstretched. However, success builds upon success. It leads to more success. So as we publish, other people come forward, usually through the community of human rights networks, with maybe tips or suggestions on where we should focus our precious resources in terms of research time. And so in the case of India, I can say that, look, there are so many examples of extensive surveillance and surveillance abuse that you just try to pick the cases that seem urgent to you and that have some kind of credible evidence behind it. So that's what we've been doing, and thankfully we've been able to shed light on some of these cases, hopefully in an instructive way to inspire people to do something about it, to change the equation. But it's not just what's going on in India. It's, Mexico is a very similar in some respects to the Indian situation, insofar as we've seen widespread serial abuse of not just Pegasus, but other types of surveillance technologies, a real problem around a lack of accountability and the use of this technology to target political opposition, lawyers, human rights activists. So yeah, we have a couple of places around the world that are in really dire straits right now because of this powerful technology and the lack of safeguards.
I'm just going to put my questions on hold for just a minute or two because I can see some questions coming in from the audience. There's a question that's come on their YouTube channel, possibly something that we have touched upon a little bit, who asks, how far is sort of data harvesting really breaching anyone's privacy when, as you said, we ourselves are allowing them to track everything, our location and our digital exhaust is robust and thick?
Well, that's an interesting way of phrasing it, because it is true. A lot of the applications that we download on our phones request permission, and we consent to using them. No one's putting a gun to our head and saying, hey, you must use Google or Facebook. People love it, right? And they use it. The problem is, on a number of levels, the free will behind that choice is a bit dubious. What do I mean by that? First of all, look at the terms of consent of any application on your device right now. You will encounter 50 pages of legalese that very few people read, let alone can understand. You have to be a lawyer to, and this is an agreement that's designed to protect the company from liability, not protect you, and give them permission to essentially appropriate your personal data as their private property, right? The companies also use various sleights of hand to trick you in various ways. They make the technology very addictive. We are beginning to understand the addictive qualities and some of the harms around social media. This is why people scroll endlessly, right? It's very Pavlovian. It's very B.F. Skinner 101. So we're not entering into an agreement with 100% knowledge of the terms of the agreement, and we're being duped in various ways. So that's how I would answer that question.
So this isn't an informed decision sort of
Yes.
in our right minds completely. I think the second question also sort of leads to that, because I think this is an important sort of touch point for an ordinary citizen. The person asks, what can ordinary citizens then do to avoid this surveillance, so to speak? And I love this question. Does getting a base model help for one? Should we chuck away our smartphones and go back to those simple ones? What remedial measures, he or she asks, would you suggest?
Wow, that's an important but also very complicated question to answer, because Our report just published this morning shows that the latest evolution of NSO's Pegasus spyware involves what we call zero click. So they can simply target a phone and take it over. And there's very little observable evidence happening on the part of the victim. So you don't even know that your phone has been commandeered. And if you have the latest version of Apple iOS at the time, even that won't defend you, as we've shown, because these were, at the time of the hacking, software vulnerabilities that even Apple itself was unaware of. The reality is we have these companies that put a lot of resources into quickly pushing out products and applications. They do spend time on security. Apple has a very well-resourced, talented security team. But the problem is the adversaries, which in this case would be a company like NSO, and there are many companies like it, spend a lot of resources of their own scouring those applications, the software, for bugs that they can exploit. And there are so many of them. That's the reality of this invasive by design ecosystem that we live in. So how do we fix that? Oh my goodness, it's very difficult. How do you defend against it? Sadly, I don't think there is currently a defense. It really disturbs me to say this, because we have activists, emailing us and saying, what can I do to prevent being targeted? Well, I'm sorry to say there is nothing right now, which means we have to think about wholesale changes to the entire infrastructure, the regulatory and technological infrastructure. That's going to take a long time. It's not impossible, but it is a very steep mountain that we have to climb to change this.
There's another question that's come on NSO in specific, that has the group provided the thorough vetting process? And I think there were some public statements to that regard, considering they sold their product to Mexico and to many other countries.
Did NSO do a vetting? No, obviously not.
Have they provided proof of a thorough vetting process?
No, they don't do anything like that. They say they do, but obviously they don't. It's clear to me that what they are doing is PR theater. They hire these public relations firms and lawyers essentially to cover themselves and to make themselves appear, I don't know to who, because it's clear to me, we've been doing this research for long enough, that their statements are baseless. They obviously do not do due diligence. I mean, how can you sell repeatedly to Saudi Arabia? What do you think Bahrain is going to do with your spyware? I mean, this is, as I say, gross negligence in the name of profit.
But as you rightly said, previously in our conversation, there are many, many levers to this, right? Considering this is military grade, considering there's an Israeli defense ministry, considering it has links with other countries. I want to circle back, considering you worked on NSO and Pegasus and other spyware for years now. How intimate has the invasion become? I mean, how close are they to knowing everything about us? Where did it start and how quickly has it traveled?
Well, again, this can't be answered without thinking about the business model and surveillance capitalism that we've kind of sleepwalked into. It's happened so quickly. Within my lifetime, I can remember, there not being the internet and certainly not having mobile phones. Just within the last, 15 years now, we've just dove headlong into this embrace of a technology that is effectively turning our lives inside out. So every aspect of our personal lives is now being observed. And when you have an ecosystem that's poorly regulated and invasive by design like that, inevitably bad governments are going to exploit that. It's instructive to me, looking historically, how important the Arab Spring was in this regard. So we all remember the Arab Spring, where people were mobilized using digital technology and social media. People were calling it a Twitter revolution, a Facebook revolution, and so forth. Well, the dictators and autocrats around the world took a different lesson. They observed what was going on and said to themselves, how do we prevent this from ever happening again? And they went out and they contracted with countless numbers of surveillance companies that provided them with tools, techniques, services, and products that effectively have enabled them to track, hack, and neutralize political opposition, both domestically and abroad. We are seeing an epidemic of transnational digital repression. And this is not something that was designed by Facebook or Zuckerberg or even ourselves. We didn't, it's often the case in history. Unanticipated consequences are like a master narrative. We do something and we don't see how it's going to rebound and impact us unexpectedly. And that's what happened. That's what's happened with social media. We've developed this system that has all sorts of pathologies that is dysfunctional in many ways and causing widespread harm. How to fix it? Well, there are so many different components to the solution set here. But the bottom one I would just recommend to everybody is to think about restraint. Think about restraint mechanisms. What does restraint look like in the context of India around security agencies? What would it look like to be able to control abuse by local police? How would we do that, right? That's what we need to work on at a very ground level in every jurisdiction. We need to do that here in Toronto. We have police that abuse their power here in Toronto. They use facial recognition, artificial intelligence, very poor oversight. We need to work on that here in Canada, just like you do in Delhi.
There's a question that's come from one of the viewers who's watching in, and he speaks about Shashi Tharoor's opinion, the Indian parliamentarian who was there in the first part of the program, that the best and perhaps the only viable option for a so-called victim of Pegasus today in India is to approach the judiciary.
Perhaps. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Indian judicial politics to know whether that will lead to something or not. The problem is you, as an individual, there's very little you can do to defend yourself against this type of extra legal surveillance. If it's not Pegasus, it will be something else. It could be a storefront hack for hire operation, like the one we discovered in Delhi called Beltrox, that was behind a massive global espionage campaign. It could be a mass surveillance technology. The cell phone infrastructure is notoriously insecure. There are vendors that can provide to virtually any client details on a person's location and even intercept their SMS messages for several $100s on the black market. We live in a fundamentally broken ecosystem right now, and it's being exploited widely by government agents.
We're heading towards the end of this conversation, and I don't want to leave on a pessimistic note, so to speak. But I know that Dr. Tharoor, when he was possibly in the first part of this this particular program, had really spoken about, the limited nature of what Parliament can do. They can't subpoena, they can't ask for evidence. There are only a certain ways to go, perhaps a commission of inquiry, etc. So sort of the Parliament being, and really here in India, even our standing committees, etc., or our special committees have found it tough to get the government to respond in a coherent manner on Pegasus. Right. So in a sense, people are looking towards judicial scrutiny. I'm wondering at an institutional level, what are the safeguards we must have? And do you believe India has those safeguards? Let's say if they were to work in a far more robust manner, would they help in some way?
Definitely, the solution has to involve proper independent agencies that have meaningful oversight. So these, you find vestiges of this in other country contexts, whether it's, United States, they have special Senate committees where senators are able to, they're privy to classified intelligence, and their job is to monitor the security agencies. There's a court that the NSA, the National Security Agency, has to go to that provides a degree of oversight. But these are all flawed in various ways for various reasons, right? But we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we need to start somewhere. And what I would advocate at a policy level is for Indians who care about this topic to elect officials who will vow to rein in this type of abuse and work towards building appropriate independent safeguards. Typically, that should be made up of a broad cross-section of credible people whose authority is respected, journalists, judiciary, former politicians, etc. And they need to have access to what the agencies are doing behind closed doors. And they're a watchdog with formal powers. That's what we all have to work towards. It's going to be very tough because in some countries right now, think about Saudi Arabia, for example, it's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. So we also have to look at the industry. And although we may not be able to change the outlook in Israel, we can do a lot in other regions around the world. And again, this is not an Israel-only problem. It's a problem of this industry. So the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, France, European Union, they bear a lot of responsibility as well. All of these countries are in this business. We may not hear about their vendors, but you can bet that the Canadian government, the US government are using spyware technology to do various things right now. They have a responsibility, I would say, to step up, speak out against these abuses and start taking steps to build global regulations around this industry. It can be done. I believe that the executives of NSO Group should be considered for something like a Magnitsky sanctions list. Why are we allowing these people to profit from the harms that they are facilitating? They should be punished for that. And there are mechanisms, legal, regulatory mechanisms, like the Magnitsky Act, that could be employed in this case.
Ron, is there a figure to the global surveillance market?
Well, the problem is there are figures out there, many billions of dollars. The companies are valued publicly, billions of dollars. The problem is a lot of the contracting takes place in secret. The companies themselves employ various shell games where they have front companies and shell companies that they employ to essentially mask their profits and revenue streams from investigations. So it's large, is what I'd say, and growing.
It's large and growing. I had a couple of rapid fire kind of questions. We're almost just about 2 to 3 minutes left. I'll see if there are any other questions that have come in. None so far. But just someone from sort of my team asked, does the country of origin of your phone matter? Are Chinese phones more susceptible?
Yes and no. So one should always be, as much as possible, acutely aware of the circumstances under which the software was designed and the origins of the device. A context like China has a very transparent cybersecurity law that requires all companies operating in China to undertake surveillance of their users. We have done at the Citizen Lab extensive investigations into WeChat, where we observed that the company does surveillance of its international users and uses that surveillance at the moment to refine its censorship domestically. You can't trust any technology, right? This gets back to Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. You have to lift the lid on all of this, which is, by the way, another part of what I believe to be the solution around this is to enable people to open up their devices. Most of the technology that we rely on is like a black box. We don't know what's going on inside because of proprietary protections. If I try to open up this device, the warranty is voided, right? I learned a lot when I was in India, actually, about the right to repair. People should be allowed by law to open up their devices and repair and inspect them. Encouraging that type of curiosity would be a good first step to equipping people with defenses against this type of surveillance.
The next question is that if every time I get a notification that asks me to allow that particular application to give access to my location, my images, my photographs, videos, what should I do? Should I say yes or no, or should I do a sort of SWOT analysis?
Well, that's up to everybody. Everybody has to make their own decisions about what's convenient or not, and where insecurities may lie. I think it's very important to understand what you're giving away as much as possible, and do scrutinize those terms of service. Apple actually makes it quite convenient for you to turn off location tracking for all of the applications you download. I would encourage people to do things like that. I mean, basically, this is about data minimization, another form of personal restraint, right? Like we need to be a bit more judicious about what we give away. You know, our personal data has value and it gives us autonomy. We shouldn't just routinely shed all of this data to companies that are going to use it to make money. It's our data. We need to take ownership over it. And that's something that I would encourage everybody to think personally about how you can do this better. It's kind of like the attitude that we encourage people around environmental sustainability. I mean, in my lifetime, I can remember people just throwing trash in the street and, throwing away garbage and not recycling. Now, most of us think very carefully about our personal consumption habits. We need to do the same vis-a-vis the data ecosystem that we live in.
That's a wonderful way to think about it. So think about the data you're putting out in a sustainable fashion, how much you want to give out, etc. In India, I've heard this argument a lot, and I find so much evidence to the contrary. I found this argument a lot that this privacy, data protection, sort of your rights around this is such a elitist concept. It sits with people who are sitting in metros and have access to power. Really, for the average Indian, it's not a bread and butter issue. And yet, I find so much evidence of it that people who have Aadhaar cards in India or PAN cards in India, are often so cagey about giving that. I'm wondering why we can't join the two to create more awareness about all this document, about all these numbers, about all this data, and that sort of belongs to us or sits so closely with our identity.
Well, I think that's where we are grateful to the work of organizations like IFF for raising these issues and educating people. And one can only hope that work of organizations like IFF will help bring about the change that you describe.
Fair enough. Ronald, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I could really go on for a really long time, but thank you so much for answering really every question. But if you think I've left out some sort of big aspect, in this entire debate, in this entire conversation, please, the floor is yours.
Well, we've been saying a lot of negative things about surveillance in the context of India. I also want to say how much I love India and I love Indian people, and I can't wait to get back and visit all my friends in the country.
There's one more question. You're more than welcome. Just one last question. How do you recommend digital rights organizations in some of our countries begin to develop in-house capacity for this kind of work so that they don't have to rely on few of the organizations in other countries? This is in relation to independent forensic analysis.
This is a question that touches at my heart because I'm an academic, and one of my goals is to essentially proselytize the mission of the Citizen Lab. As I said, we're a small organization. There are very few organizations that do the type of work that we do in this space. Amnesty International Tech Lab is another one. We need to see more Amnesty Tech Labs, more Citizen Labs. How do we make that happen? This is field building, right? We need there to be citizen labs in universities in India, and professors who take on the same type of research, educate their students who graduate and then do that sort of thing professionally. We need to build that organically from the ground up. There's no reason it can't be done. What Citizen Lab, very bright researchers, incredibly talented people, but it's not rocket science. Right? We're not building a spaceship. We're doing these forensic investigations that are all open source. You can read our reports and find out how we did it ourselves and duplicate those methods if you want. I encourage that type of ingenuity all over the world. I hope there 1,000 Amnesty Tech Labs and Citizen Labs in 5 years from now.
Amen to that. And with that, I hand it to you, Anushka.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to thank Ms. Bosley and Professor Liebert for gracing us with your presence at today's event. Your valuable inputs will surely be beneficial to our community, and while your comments are scary, they will allow us to be more aware of the danger we are in as a society if such surveillance goes on unchecked, and why we continuously need to fight against it. I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in to listen to the two conversations and IFF's wider community. Thank you for continuously engaging with us at these events, which not only makes them a success, but also motivates us to continuously organize better ones. IFF's goal is to ensure that Indian citizens can use the internet and other developing technology with liberties guaranteed by the Constitution. This work needs your continued support. I urge each and every one of you, if you're not already, please, please, please become an IFF member today and donate to us today. By becoming a member and demonstrating your support, you will show us that our work matters and motivates us to keep doing better. Finally, I would like to thank the IFF team, which includes Shivani Singh, Farkhanda Zahoor, Arjasmita Chaudhary, and obviously our Executive Director, Apar Gupta, for making sure this event runs smoothly. Goodbye, and I hope to see you at the